I'm Jacob Kennedy.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of your awkward translator's favorite podcast. It's Speech from the Throne, episode 29.
We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the halls of power.
But not with more of Xi Jinping screaming bloody murder at your open democratic discourse. We're just here to argue.
Hey, Jacob, what are we arguing about today?
Well, as you probably guessed from today's memes, we're talking about China and this country's rapidly evolving relation to that country. We've just had, as we referred to in the opening, a very combative dialogue between Justin Trudeau and Xi Jinping during the G20 last week, where essentially, first off, China tried to snub us entirely by not scheduling a bilateral meeting between Trudeau and Xi Jinping. And Trudeau essentially had to stop Xi Jinping in the hallways and pin him down and talk to him, outlining his concerns about Chinese interference in our elections. And not only did Xi not like this very much, he especially did not like headlines that started propping up in Western newspapers a few hours after that conversation that essentially made Xi sound like he had been, taken on the back foot from this conversation. And so trying to reassert his big man dominance, trying to show Trudeau just the size of his girthy cock. He had to stand up there and basically walk right up to him, start telling him, this is not acceptable. It's not how we do things. Pissant Canada can't be telling your newspapers what you and I talk about in private. And if you see the video there of this exchange, Trudeau, at first, he doesn't really seem to understand what's going on. I mean, this is
I think he's just
pretty
listening
common.
because the translation's delayed.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And again, there's no real reason for Xi Jinping to be angry. This is something that Canada does with all bilateral meetings. We always will give the press a short explanation of what was said between the two leaders, and we expect that the other country will do exactly the same to their press. I mean, not in China because they don't have a free press, but even their state mouthpieces, you would expect would offer at least some brief explanation as to what the two leaders said. It seemed here that, no, China just wanted to pick a fight. Xi Jinping didn't like the fact that he was criticized, obviously. He didn't like the fact that those criticism got picked up in the Western newspaper, and so he thought, I'm going to take Canada down a peg because, they're a whipping boy. This is a position that Canada, unfortunately, has seen itself in many, many times.
I have two readings. Xi's plan was obviously to admonish him and then walk out before he was done. Come on. Everybody knows that. However, I think faced with that sort of situation, I think Trudeau did anything that you would expect him or anyone else to do, which was first to listen, because first you have to figure out what's being said, so you're delayed anyway. Being admonished and you're delayed at realizing you're being admonished. And then what you see a sort of switch in his face where he realizes it's a negative comment. And sure, he responds with, kind of diplomatese or whatever, but that's it. That's as much as you'd expect anybody to do, oh, well, we're going to continue to have free discussions about it. It's like, yeah, sure. Is it meaningless on its face? Yeah. Does Xi care to listen, stick around till he finishes? No. But does Trudeau come off looking like he was whipped around as much as, more than anybody else would look like they were whipped around or not? I don't think so. But anyway, sorry, continue your spiel. That was just my notes about it.
No, I think that's entirely true. But it's been the reaction to this event that I most wanted to bring up, because I think in Canada we had a very, very extreme reaction to this, and I think it's sort of released some underlying issues that I would like to address, in particular in the way that we view this country, in the way that we view our relationship to China, and in the way that we are projecting the relationship is going to evolve in the future. So my girlfriend is Chinese. She's born in Guangzhou, and I was really confused by this conversation because when I was reading Canadian social media, there was a divide between Mandarin speakers. There was some that said the way that Xi Jinping was speaking in that clip was sort of implying a threat, that he was saying do this or else. And there were others who were saying, this is just pretty standard disappointed father figure speech. So this is just we're the big powerful country. You're the tiny insignificant country. You shouldn't be acting this way, and I'm disappointed in your behavior. And when I asked my girlfriend, we watched it together, and she was like, no, this is clearly more, this is not really meant to be a threat. But that's clearly not how we interpreted it at all. And I think the reason why Canada feels so insecure, it's not just the fact that this is a country that kidnapped a couple of our diplomats and held them in solitary confinement for years. It's also because we've been... Oh, sorry, losing my voice. My voice. It's the reason why we feel.
It's all good. You deserve
The
water.
reason why we feel. Thank you. The reason why we feel so threatened. It's not just because this is a country that has embargoed our trade without explanation. A country that has kidnapped our citizens without explanation. But I think we're also buying into a lot of American lines, particularly in relationship to Taiwan, where the expectation is that this is a country that is trying to dominate us in some way, that this is a threat to the liberal democratic regime that we have in Canada. And that's where I would like to take this conversation, because I do think that we freak out a little bit too much in relationship to this country. And it's time for us to dial back a little bit and to understand the context a little bit better before we completely outplay our hand. And I know we're in a good position right now, particularly with the war in Ukraine, where we're thinking, you know what, we can actually push back against these authoritarians. We're stronger than we were before. The West is coming together, and it's time to press our advantage. But I always want to express a word of caution that when you're talking about a nuclear-armed state, a state that could bring all life on Earth to an end, it's important to be a little more cautious and not just necessarily to go after your first reaction. Because when people get freaked out, when people get stressed out, and when they start overreacting, that's when we get into really, really dangerous situations, particularly when you have troops on the ground and West versus East fights right now in Ukraine. A fight that can always get worse. I've read a lot of commentary about this interaction between Trudeau and Xi Jinping, where the context in every political opinion column was saying this is happening at a time when China is trying to dominate the world. And that's a really important context that needs to be problematized just a little bit. I don't think China wants to dominate the world. I think China just wants to be respected by the world. The most famous dynasty in the Chinese history is the Tang Dynasty, which wasn't very large geographically. It's about half the size that China is now. But it just basically was respected, and all the leaders from Central Asia, from Southeast Asia, would pay tribute to the Tang Emperor, but they didn't really control those countries. And so if you think of comparing to people that dynasties that we really like in the West, like Alexander the Great. In the West, we're really focused on conquerors. In China, historically, people are more interested in poets and the culture. They're interested in leaders that command a great deal of respect from other nations, but not necessarily leaders who conquer other nations. Just a very different idea of what a good leader is and what an ideal state is. And so, yes, in the West, if we saw a leader acting like Xi Jinping is, we would expect he's ready to start an invasion. He's ready to become a world conqueror. But in the Chinese context, that's not necessarily true. So I don't doubt that there's threats, and we can talk about the threats. But again, we're getting these really nebulous interactions where there's confrontations, there's obviously challenges, but we don't necessarily need to always reach for the nuclear button in every opportunity. And when there is a nuclear button to reach for, it's time to find a way to tone things down. What the Chinese want is respect, and that is something we can actually give.
But you don't gain respect by kidnapping two of our citizens.
Oh, I agree.
But there's contributions on both sides to this breakdown, but I don't want to both sides it and just leave it at that. I want to get into the nuance. And I suspect you do too, and certainly there's part of this is a lack of understanding of maybe Confucianism and Chinese culture in the West as much as there's a misunderstanding of the West and the East. Of course there's misunderstandings about the East, obviously, including probably misunderstandings that I have simply because I haven't learned enough about it, and I should go out and learn more about it. And I think that the rise of anti-Asian hate is terrible. It's awful. It's abhorrent. It goes without saying. And it's certainly that the rise of anti-Asian hate can get bundled up in and tangled up in the rise of maybe hawkish rhetoric towards China in some cases, and it can get wrapped up and tangled up with COVID conspiracies, and did. I have a friend who's of Chinese descent. She's Canadian, born here, doesn't matter. She happens to be of Chinese descent, and had one of her profs ask her once if she was going to give him COVID, like just a totally inappropriate thing to say, and oh, yeah. You're good, right? You're not going to give it to me, ha ha ha, because he knew that she was of that descent. It's what a completely inappropriate thing to say. So I'm not going to say that there aren't.
That's crazy.
There's absolutely there's been a backlash towards Chinese Canadians that hasn't been okay. Just like I think sometimes there's a backlash from some of us in progressive circles to ignore the fact that some of our fellow progressives are maybe anti-Semitic, but that's a whole other discussion in itself.
Yep. True.
That's another issue. It can creep into circles, even circles that consider themselves to be progressive circles. We saw that with Joel Harden and earlier this week.
You sure did.
In a big way. But to get back to the Chinese specific blowback, it hasn't been okay. It hasn't been okay. It's affected my friends. I've seen how it's affected them. On the other hand, entirely, the West's human rights fuck-ups, and there are plenty as well, notwithstanding, including existing human rights fuck-ups that we have to solve. Of course, the Chinese aren't ever going to listen to us because of that. They'll just call us hypocrites. It's their trump card anyway. Well, you're hypocrites. We're not going to take it from you. On the flip side, I think it is completely justified to be angry with a regime that arbitrarily detained two of our citizens. Perhaps we didn't need to intervene on the U.S.'s request. We did, because they're an ally. We were trying to help them out. That was retaliation. It happened. They used our citizens as retaliation. It was disgusting. Yeah. They're en masse killing and threatening and detaining Uyghur Muslims. That's a minority population of Muslims in China. It's not to say that we haven't been perfectly kind to our minorities all the time, particularly indigenous people. I'm not going to try to say here that we're patron saints, but I also find that what I have trouble with is your notion and your argument that we should tone down the rhetoric, and I don't entirely disagree to say that for us to just go, you're a bully, no you are, no you are, no you are, no you are, we'll go back and forth forever, for sure. And you made a point before we started recording that do we just follow up human suffering with more human suffering by just turning up the heat until there's no end in sight? And I hear that, but at the same time I think it's very difficult, especially when meeting people where they're at, just like how you say that a lot of Xi's crackdown on Uyghurs was due to public pressure, which is abhorrent, but you say that was a factor. Well, there's a lot of public pressure here, particularly here at home, to say that it's unrealistic to turn the temperature down significantly, if at all, because of how things have been with China in recent years. I mean, somebody's got to turn the temperature down at some point. You can't just keep turning it up. I agree. But I think it's hard to meet people where they're at on this file and go, okay, we need to relax. Let's just turn it all down. I think you have a point when you say that we need to promote human rights in China in a different way, less through lectures and more through more covert means. And I think that's easy to say. I think it's harder to do. So that's why I think I find I agree with your point. I find to an extent, but I find your solution to be a little bit, well, wouldn't it be nice if, or not that it isn't doable, but it's just very hard to accomplish, I think. And maybe you can help me change my mind about that. I'm not sure, but that's how I feel.
So we're talking about what China wants is to be respected. How can we do this? First off, when you have something like the interaction between Xi Jinping and Justin Trudeau, it is commonplace for us to release a statement of an interaction with a foreign head of state to the media. But Justin Trudeau didn't have to release it immediately after his interaction with Xi Jinping, he could have waited until the G20 was over and then sent that press release, right? There's no requirement for him to humiliate Xi Jinping in the same meeting, unless it was Trudeau's plan all along to have something like this to play to domestic audiences.
I mean, if you don't
like,
want to be humiliated about election interference, then don't commit election interference.
Okay, well, I'll get to that point later. But you could say that to the Americans, like committing election interference is just something that a big state does. That's when you're a big daddy state.
Oh, sure, everybody spies.
You intervene in the election of other people.
Sure.
Like that's
spy.
how you prove. Yeah, that's exactly. That's how you prove that you're important in the world. Like, I don't think you can ever blame another country for interfering in the election of another country. You're trying to pursue your policies, and I would much prefer that China pursue its interests by intervening in elections than by invading a country and forcing them to change their ways, right?
Sure, but that's when you present it as a choice between two very shitty outcomes. One is definitely objectively more shitty, but they're both shitty, and it's like, it's not that they shouldn't be forwarding their interests or whatever, or having a channel or a place to do that, but of course it's going to get media scrutiny when that comes out, and the fact that the PM claims he wasn't briefed, which is either an outright lie or an embarrassment, is also concerning. But
I also think so. Another thing, like the reason why the two Michaels were kidnapped is because we imprisoned Meng Wanzhou on an American indictment. But what was Meng Wanzhou actually accused of? She wasn't accused of
fraud.
She wasn't. She was accused of fraud, but she broke American sanction laws in dealing with Iran.
Yes.
So
the Chinese
what did
ally.
she do? So. Yeah. So what did she actually do? Like, there was no one in America was harmed. Not by what Huawei was doing in this case. It's just America said, you guys, anyone in the world, cannot trade with Iran anymore. We have decided we don't like this country, and you're not allowed to trade.
And that was under
and
Trump.
If you do
so
trade,
Trump's
and if
overreach.
you do trade with Iran, we're gonna imprison you. And I think the question we have to ask is, if we respect another country, why do we think we have the right to say something like that, right? Like this, I don't think it's actually asking that much to not imprison the CFO of one of the most powerful companies of the second most powerful country in the world for trading with their ally, right?
On its
is
face,
that a really difficult thing to ask?
On its face, I would agree, but there are a complicating set of circumstances that I think affected the response of the Canadian government, and one of those was the fact that Trump was president. And I think if Biden wasn't president, I don't know, maybe they wouldn't have been arrested. I'm not sure. But Trump was president. He overreached on a lot of shit. If you remember, he was also quite mercurial with Mr. Trudeau himself. Maybe Trudeau thought that by chucking old daddy Trump this carrot, that maybe it would be another way for him to maintain good relations with him. And I'm not saying that was right or wrong, but I'm thinking that was the reason. They were enforcing what the Americans wanted them to enforce. That is very much true. It is also very much true that Iran, whether the Americans like it or not, is an ally of China. I mean, that being said, it's a shocking overreach in itself, the response of the Chinese administration. A shocking overreach in itself. That we won't soon forget, that have damaged, and they would claim we damaged it by intervening on Trump's behalf, I guess, I'm sure. But it is, regardless of who you want to blame for it, it's damaged things quite a bit. So that's why I say, like, here in the current moment, it's very hard to try to get people to start to turn the temperature down. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't start to work towards that, but it's very hard to be the first one to kind of start to do that, given the way we've been slapped around simply by pointing out things that we don't like.
Yeah, it's totally true, but I think it sort of ignores a very central point of realpolitik. I mean, I think we all accept when the Americans slap us around that we can't do anything about it. Small states get slapped around by big states, and the only protection you have from that is to become a big state yourself. You can make whatever liberal order you want, but at the end of the day, you're never going to be able to walk away from that simple fact of realpolitik, that large states bully big states. And so, China's,
so America and China both bullied us in different ways.
Exactly. So there's no world where you get to just ignore that is something that happens. But there are ways that you can prevent the bullying, or that you can try to respect a little bit better the position of your adversaries and not needlessly incense people that you have no ability to beat. So it's like, I have no problem with us dealing intensely and so adversarially against the Chinese, but we don't have a backup plan if things go badly. We don't have a way to manufacture domestically all the stuff that they make for us right now, and we don't have extra markets that we can sell our agricultural produce to if they stop buying. So if we actually go down this path of decoupling our economy, which is the asserted goal of this government's new Indo-Pacific strategy, and if the Conservatives are elected, they plan to go even further, there's not really a new area for growth. It's
But
also, when are you being asked? Like, you're asking us to reduce our reliance on China when we already have existing supply chain problems and massive inflation. Like, if you're talking about a decades-long strategy of decoupling, I'm fully on board for this. If you're talking about decoupling in a few years, there's no question people are going to have a huge shock to their livelihood. The bigger issue for me is, particularly if we get into some very combative stances over Taiwan and we get into a war, then we'll have to decouple our economies immediately. And even if we can somehow fight a war with China and avoid nuclear Armageddon, which is tough, even if we can somehow avoid the end of humanity in such a conflict, the simple decoupling of the economy will undoubtedly cause so much economic strife. I mean, like, people dying and people starving to death in China because they're not getting access to food around the world. Their deaths count too. And there's 1.4 billion people that could potentially be dead.
Oh, sure.
In
No one's discounting the human toll that would take place all across the world if there was a war. No one wants a war.
Exactly. And I don't think
Biden or Jinping want a war.
No, but then you have Canadian journalists like Chantal Hébert that said on the Peter Mansbridge podcast that a war over Taiwan has become inevitable, and that's
it's because Biden keeps pushing or Pelosi and Biden, I guess, together have kept kind of pushing because they've said in the past they defend Taiwan and they've reaffirmed that, so that scared everybody, including China. And certainly it's dangerous if they were to go significantly further, like such as suddenly recognizing them right now, I think would probably be a bad call. But I think that's why they're also covertly starting to talk to them. It's like, well, if you're going to treat us this way, particularly I think Canadians, I think Americans is just a classic like West versus East supremacy battle. I'm not talking about this is the Americans' point of view. I'm talking about this is Canadian point of view. If you're going to slap us around this way, then we're just going to go with the Americans and we're going to start talking to Taiwan a little more. And I don't think that means we're going to recognize them. I would think it would be dangerous if that was in the cards. But it does mean that we're gonna go this way a little bit, and then we're also gonna call you out on your bullshit in the South China Sea, just like you call us out on all our bullshit. It's impossible to, except in the event of a war where it will be necessary, it's impossible to decouple overnight. It's impossible, I think, perhaps to even decouple entirely. I do think it is possible to reduce your reliance over several years. You'd have to have an appropriate timeline to get that done. I do think even down to our very fibers, me and you, whether we realize it or not, sometimes we're deeply influenced by the culture in which we grew up. Same with people from the East. So I do think that there's a bit of cultural misunderstanding here. I just think it's hard to pick this moment as the moment that we should just go, okay, everything's fine now. Yeah, send your trade groups. Yeah, come on, let's negotiate a free trade deal. No, it doesn't have to include human rights. Let's do this, let's do that. It's just not the moment for it, but I also don't think it's the moment to push aggressively hard on something like Taiwan. I think it's a very tense time. I think you can push a little bit on Taiwan, but you can only push too much. I think ideologically, I think it, probably we probably should work towards recognizing Taiwan, but we can't do that with Xi, and we can't do that right now. So
yeah. So in the middle of the 19th century, when Brazil became independent of Portugal, they became a pretty powerful state, but they basically needed the British Navy to guarantee their independence. And Brazil maintained slavery until the 1880s. They were the last country in the Americas to outlaw slavery. And of course, Britain, which outlawed slavery in the 1830s, it was super unpopular back home. The fact that British tax dollars were going, or tax pounds, I guess, were going to maintain the security of a country that maintained slavery. And slavery was a huge scale in Brazil. There are millions, many more slaves in Brazil than there ever were in the United States, in the South, and for hundreds of years longer. And so Brazil, in the last 20 years of their slave regime, they passed laws that effectively outlawed slavery, but just were never enforced. So, and in fact, and still to this day, in Brazilian Portuguese, they have a term called a law that exists for the eyes of the British, or just something that exists for the eyes of the British, essentially. And that's when you do something purely for the public clout, but you continue doing what you wanted to do anyways in private. And I think we have to ask what our goal is here, because China could do that. And effectively, that is what they did for the first few years of their joining the International Trade Organization, where this genocide of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang is not an old thing. It's been happening for decades. The party policy towards Uyghurs has gotten much more intense, but they've had that sort of a policy towards their Muslim minorities since the early 2000s. It's only very recently that we have really changed this stance, and that's because the Chinese are no longer basically actively hiding what they're doing, and they're much more willing and much more public with their goals towards the Uyghurs, whereas before they were preferring to hide what they were doing so that we Westerners didn't feel bad about it when we were trading. The question we have to ask is, do we want the state to just tell us that they're no longer infringing on the rights of the Uyghurs so that we can trade with them with an innocent conscience? Or do we want things to actually change on the ground?
We want things to change on the ground because in the age of the internet, you can't just say, everybody knows what's happening or not. It's going to get out, even if you're in China. It's gotten out. So their camps that they claim not to actually be what they are, things have gotten out.
Then the question becomes, or you want something more than just a bland commitment to human rights. How do you ensure that happens in a country where the native philosophy of China does not necessarily include a respect for individual human rights? There's no philosophical compromise between the West, because especially when I'm talking to Chinese people, it's not like they're monsters who believe that humans don't need to be treated badly. It tends to be that the unit of analysis is different. That it's the family that's the most important, or it's the nation that's the most important, and they think of the rights of the family or the rights of the nation, not necessarily about the rights of the individual. Right? It's a different hierarchy of needs. It's a different unit of analysis. And so fundamentally what we have here is a philosophical issue that needs to be resolved. And it's not necessarily...
But can it be resolved? I'm skeptical that it even can be resolved. I think that's the heart of this.
Well, absolutely it can be resolved, because we see that other countries can mesh Western values of human rights with their existing philosophical structures. But it just takes a lot of time, and it usually has to be done voluntarily. When the regime changes overnight, when people are forced to change their political situation, that's when things get really nasty really fast.
It will take internal gradual change, and that's extremely difficult to execute. That's why I think it's too easy to say, okay, let's just be really nice to them now. It's okay, that's one piece.
It's not about being nice, but the reason why the CCP has been able to control China so effectively is not because the population actually likes rule under the party. It's just that the CCP has completely destroyed any political opposition, and they've been very zealous about ensuring that no one else can organize in the state. So we could get rid of the Chinese Communist Party, and let's say there's a coup, we get rid of the party. There's not going to be another party that takes over. There's not going to be a multi-party general election. There's just going to be complete anarchy. which tends to happen in China after the end of the dynasty. There's like 100 or 200 years of anarchy and complete war where tens of millions of people die. You have to build a political organization.
And you can't
if you
do
want
that in a
to
state where
actually
everything's
do that.
crushed. That's the problem.
Oh, Westerners can build. Oh,
You
see,
can, but you
this
have
is
to
the
do
thing.
it covertly. You have to do
So
it like
this is-
like the Polish, for example, did it in churches. You know, like for them,
Yes.
religion was their crux. So you can't get away with that in China. But there's ways. You know, they could find something culturally that works for them as a way to spread
No,
change.
and Christian missionaries traditionally, and this is the colonial model, was that you would use Christian missionaries to build basically another bureaucracy in a country, so that when the time was right to destroy the indigenous administration, there was another bureaucracy that could take over, and the church was usually an effective crutch for that. Now, we want to move past that model, obviously, but history does provide an option. But that's something that takes decades of work, and it takes a lot of money to invest.
Well, it's like you were
So
saying
we're
about the
serious
alt-right, like figures starting to give granola bars and drugs or whatever to addicts on the street or something like
Exactly.
that.
Organization is always the best option, and that's something that I think the right absolutely understands. And it's not an inherently evil tactic, it's just a tactic that can be used for evil means. Like, obviously, when colonizers were using the missionaries in the church as a way of slowly over decades taking over an indigenous society, that's not a good tactic. But we can learn from the past, we can see how our forefathers dealt with similar situations, and we can employ similar techniques in the advancement of something like human rights. Now, personally, I prefer that we find a way to make this a little more consensual. I think that we should just try to promote liberals in the Chinese Communist Party and try to change the party over time. Honestly, though, the best time to do that was in 1989, and after Tiananmen Square, a lot of the liberals in the party have been purged, and obviously Xi Jinping's been even worse in going after them. I mean, there was a moment before the last Congress where it looked like perhaps his job was in jeopardy, and he's now solidified his control so much that it's looking like that's never going to be able to happen. But just because we don't like the party that's in charge and we don't like what he's doing, it doesn't mean that the alternative is better. We need to find a way to build the best possible world that we have, rather than just complaining about what exists and walking our way into a situation that's much, much worse. And when we're talking about,
chilling. That was chilling.
It was, especially someone that was a former president of China, sort of a symbol of collective leadership. Not necessarily a symbol of democracy, but a symbol of a CCP that was, although very authoritarian, at least willing to balance the opinions of their leadership. Now it's very clear that any sort of opposition, even opposition internal to the party, will no longer be accepted. I mean, that's a very dark road that we're going down.
I think that feeds part of my skepticism, where I guess maybe I was exaggerating when I'm like, okay, we'll be nice to them now. But I think that's why I'm like, okay, let's turn down the rhetoric with a guy who has done nothing but turn up the rhetoric. You know what I mean? But then he'd probably say the same thing about us, and then so we get in this endless catch-22. But then the solution is, okay, let's ratchet down the rhetoric. Okay, let's do 50 to 60 years of covert operations within their party to slowly liberalize it. There's no quick, easy solution here, sadly. And I think, I think it's beneficial to diversify your supply chain anyway. You don't want to be too dependent on one thing, but I don't know. I think it feeds my skepticism, and I think particularly the way he's led his party. So he's been the most brutal since Deng Xiaoping. It's not as if it's a cakewalk to deal with the guy, is kind of what I'm saying.
So right now, China sends millions and millions of its citizens abroad for education, has a huge diaspora of people that immigrate, but you often come back to China because China doesn't recognize dual citizenship. And I think that because China is in a position where people are now coming back to the home country, whereas before it used to be people left China for good, there's a huge opportunity for us in the West to share our ideas, to learn more about China's philosophical context and to teach our philosophical context and to make a synthesis. But I think we're just really, really bad at understanding and integrating people who think differently The case of election interference is one of like the classic examples of this, because for me, I think that we hugely overstate how controlled their election interference is in Canada. That it is true that yes, people associated with the party have organized movements in Richmond, in Markham,
recruiting
in
staffers,
large
candidates.
Yes, but it's also true that the new generation of Chinese immigrants in those communities is also fairly supportive of the party, and that if those communities were just organically organizing behind a candidate, they would undoubtedly have party members within their organizations. So it's really tough to tell the difference between the Chinese community that's genuinely supporting, exercising their democratic rights and genuinely supporting candidates, or a covert conspiracy of party operatives that are trying to influence Canadian elections. And personally, knowing that the Chinese government is really, really bad at espionage, I think it's much more likely that this is organic activity, that yes, they probably are, the party probably is trying to put their fingers in many pots, but we have to understand that this is actually what the community itself kind of wants.
Well,
and
it
that
depends.
just
As
because
you're saying, we have to be careful about the nuances. You know what I mean?
yeah. But it's like just because someone who is associated with the party is elected, it does not mean
always
that the
party
party shows that. Yes, exactly.
But
that it's like we can't just double. We cannot double think what voters have decided. That's what I'm saying.
You can't. I agree with the premise. I think where it gets more dodgy is the information that we've been presented, which is that clearly there was a concerted effort from people in the party. It doesn't mean necessarily that some of them would have been elected anyway, but I think at any time, even though obviously it happens, we know it happens, but anytime it happens, it's newsworthy, and we report on it, and it can be in major cases problematic, such as what the Americans did to South America, or what Russia did to the U.S. in 2016 and still does, and what Russia and China are trying to do with us, and what some right-wing American actors are trying to do with us, a la the convoy, So it's like, it's a whole friggin' quagmire. And bottom line, please don't be fucking racist to Chinese people because you don't like the actions of the Chinese government. Just bottom line, please don't take it out on Chinese people. It's just not fair, and I think any proper line of logic would tell you that it's not fair, and that you're acting irrationally, you're acting reactively, and you're acting like a racist. So don't do that.
Yeah. So it's like in almost every university class nowadays, there's often quite a few Chinese people, like they're from China, they're foreign students here to learn. That's how we're funding our universities basically now.
Well,
that's a great opportunity. But like 3 times as much. Yeah, but almost every time I was in those classes, the professor would stand up and like whenever they would engage the Chinese students, it would be like, "Oh, what do you guys think about your dictatorship?" or something. Like they would like this. We're just not engaging very well. There's just by constantly talking about the evil of another country, we're not really setting the stage for an effective dialogue. And I know that we do not like the way that they run their country. I get that. But you know what? Canada's not going to change that. So we have to accept that it's a dictatorship. It's a one-party state, and that's never going to really change unless the Chinese themselves decide to change it. So we now have to go past that, listen to what they're saying, learn about them as we teach them about us, and try to find a middle ground forward. We cannot have this constant combativeness where we puff out our chests and say, everything about the West is perfect. We know what human rights are. You hate human beings. We're going to make the world better. If you don't listen to us and do as we say, we're going to pummel you. That's not an effective strategy.
I think Western arrogance is part of this for sure. I will say that I think that I think that the cultural issues go a lot deeper than many people realize, and I think the columnists in all the op-ed sections in the paper, they're roaring about, we have to stand up, and you morally you should, because probably their individual values, they want to stand up for human rights. I want to stand up for human rights. Canada should be standing up for human rights. We have our own hypocrisies we haven't cleaned up. Do I think that means we shouldn't get to say anything? No, because they're going to say something about us.
It's true.
It's like, no, I'm not going to put the toy away. But do I agree that the solution is to go in there in the National Post and puff our chests out about how great and perfect we are? No, I think that's arrogant. So I take your point there. And with that, is there anything else you wanted to add, or should we send our good people heading for the exits today?
No. Have a wonderful day. I mean, I hope that by the time you're listening to this, Canada has not been removed from the World Cup. I mean, we could have this whole other conversation about whether or not we should be boycotting the World Cup in Qatar for basically all the same reasons why we would want to boycott trade with the Chinese. In fact, you could say the situation in Qatar is infinitely worse than the average person.
6,500 migrants died building the stadium.
Yeah, but instead our soccer team is playing, and we're cheering them on because it's pretty rare that Canada gets invited to the FIFA World Cup. So again, we have to really recognize who we criticize and why we choose to criticize some people and not others.
I think everybody knows the reason Qatar got the World Cup. Because Sepp Blatter was paid a ton of money. That's what happened.
Yeah.
And they would not have gotten the World Cup otherwise. That said, it's very embarrassing and sad to see that Qatar can bat around FIFA to not even allow people to draw attention to... Like, we knew the World Cup was going to happen because FIFA is a cash cow. We knew it was going to happen. Because if you're looking at it cynically, whether or not it was going to happen, whether or not you think it should have happened, which it shouldn't have it happened. That said, obviously athletes, they're still playing in it. Could they have boycotted it? Yes. They're there. Some feel quite strongly that they want to do something, and they're hardly even allowed to do that. There were a bunch of players that wanted to wear wristbands. They weren't allowed to do that. The captains are allowed to wear wristbands occasionally when the league decides it's okay because of pressure from the Qataris. Really? Seriously? Really? So, it's embarrassing on a lot of levels. On other levels, it's triumphant because you have Canada there for the first time since 1986. And you can count on one hand, I believe, the amount of times we've made FIFA. I'll have to fact-check that, but I'm pretty sure you can count on one hand the amount of times we've made FIFA.
Yeah.
It just sucks that it has to be there. It sucks that it has to be there. And it didn't have to be there. They could have moved it, but they didn't. So here we are. Playing in an oppressive regime.
I think it's exactly the same sort of reality where it's like... Would we prefer a world where China wasn't so powerful and where it wasn't necessary for us to be constantly dealing with this authoritarian regime? Yeah, probably that would be a better world. Can we get to that world? No.
You can't
so
ignore
we have to do the best. We have to do the best that we can. No, you can't ignore the world's second largest economy. You can't ignore a country that has 1.4 billion people, and you cannot ignore a country that has had a 3,000 or 4,000 years of philosophical tradition. They have important things to teach us. That's what I mean by about having basic respect. We don't know everything in the West. We don't know everything. We don't have all the answers. We actually, every now and then, we got to listen to other people and what they're telling us. And maybe sometimes they're definitely wrong, but we still got to hear them when they're wrong, and we have to understand why they're wrong. We cannot just ignore other people because we think they're icky. That's never the right answer.
I hope that everybody enjoyed listening to the podcast. I hope that you don't go out and be fucking racist. Please don't do that.
Yeah. You're discouraged.
Please express your foreign policy opposition in mature ways and normal, caring, loving ways, please. And with that, if you have anything to say about this, email it to speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. All one word, all lowercase, very easy. And we'll see you in the next one.
Bye.